Good day and welcome to another episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson. This is episode 50. My name is Boris. I shall be your mystery guest. Our colleague, Dr. Richard Bilato, cannot be here today, so I am taking his place. Today's episode will be the legacy of Daniel Jordan, who was president of Monticello, who professed the cello for a period of 24 years. The cancellation of Thomas Jefferson and Monticello began with the arrival with Peter Onuf at University of Virginia in 1989. Onuf was intent on showing nothing but the dark side of Jefferson, and throughout his tenure, he was responsible for darkening the milieu in and around Charlottesville vis-a-vis Jefferson and his legacy. In that quest, he was, says Colonel Holacek, abetted by then president of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, Dan Jordan. In this episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson, we discuss the legacy of former president of Monticello, Dan Jordan. Under whose tenureship, the intellectual climate at Monticello took an eclectic turn. You know by now the aim of the show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, to revisit and revise the revisionists who always in business of deconstructing Jefferson prose, Jefferson's letters, addresses, memos, and all kinds of things like that. Nearly all Jeffersonian biographers today take it on themselves to write on Jefferson's two-facedness, what Jefferson says most often cannot be understood literally, yet this prose must be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. Many people call Jefferson hypocrite, they call him contradiction. So this show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, aims to dispel that myth. Jefferson, we say, can be known. We use logic, not intuitive, and discretionary deconstruction is this method. So I am your host today, Boris, and I will introduce to you shortly Dr. Holacek. We call Polkovnik or Colonel. He's a professor of philosophy and history, taught at institutions like University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, Ohio University, Eastern Michigan University, and so on. He is author of over 70 books, of 30 books on Thomas Jefferson. He writes as well on Ukraine. So let us begin. I want to welcome Dr. Holacek and thank you once again for joining the show. And let me ask you several questions about President Dan Jordan. Colonel, in your short essay on Jefferson, you state that Jordan's tenureship marked a period in which the folks at Monticello aided to try to tell, this is the words, the most honest story we can about Jefferson and slavery and race, end quote. And that is based on, as they quote again, serious scholarship. What is this most honest? How can something be most honest? I don't understand. And is this really serious scholarship? Can you say some things about these things? Well, I'd like to thank you, Boris. That's Boris from Lviv in Ukraine, for that fine introduction and for doing a good job of taking the place of Dr. Bilato while he's incommoded. I'll start with your first question. And Jordan, when he took office, professed to tell the most honest story and to do some serious scholarship. I will venture to say that he did neither. Part of his legacy, as far as I'm concerned, if you look at the folks at Monticello, they'll say he did a bang-up job, but I don't agree with that. So I agree with you. I don't understand what most honest means, and how does most honest differ from honest? Honest doesn't really require a qualifier, does it? Someone's either honest or not. So that's neither here nor there. It's a little to the point. Whether or not they're doing serious scholarship, I think the folks at Monticello can be accused, and I labeled Dan Jordan here, of creating a sort of circus environment where serious scholarship has been brushed aside. for sort of partisanship, for sort of circus environment in which people who share the same derogatory views have their say, and only those people have their say. Other people's views are neglected. All right. So, who is Dan Jordan? He got his, uh, he became president of Monticello in 1985, and he was president for 24 years. He transformed the environment quite substantially. He created a 200 million plus endowment. He built the Thomas Jefferson Library, which is substantial and quite useful for scholars. He purchased historic Mont Alto Mountain. He established the Thomas Jefferson Parkway and walking trail. He brought in the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, which was established in 1994 during his tenure, and he began many educational programs. So from that perspective, from a bird's eye view, he really did a lot for Monticello. What I argue is when we get involved in the particulars here, we find a tainted or questionable legacy, I believe, at that. He did say, as you said, from January the 1st on, when he takes office, he says, we're going to try to tell the most honest story we can tell about Jefferson and slavery and race and the plantation. It's all going to be based on serious scholarship. That was a promise, he said. Those were several promises that he made, he did not keep. It's, as I argued, there is no serious scholarship here. I'll explain that in a bit. And the story is not honest. The story is political and biased, okay? Well, thank you very much, Polkovnik. Question two, you claim that Dan Jordan's legacy is tainted by two events. First is 1992 Gloves Off Conference at University of Virginia. Can you tell us something about this was, I think, put on by Peter Onuf, right? And can you tell us something about Jordan's involvement? Why do you think Jordan ought to be incriminated for this involvement? Please tell us. Well, what happened when in October 1992, Pete Onuf um, set up a conference titled Jeffersonian Legacies. And Dan Jordan wrote the foreword to a book that was subsequently published. And he wrote of this conference, and he said, revisionist in spirit, innovative in format. The conference sought new perspectives on the Jefferson legacy by measuring Jefferson's life and values against major concerns in the 1990s. The premise of the conference was that Jefferson's legacies, for better or worse, are directly relevant to some of the most crucial concerns of America and Americans in the 1990s. Now, so what we have here is a gloves off conference. He describes the environment here as a sort of intellectual free-for-all. This is Jordan speaking again, with polemical discourse, reasoned debates, brilliant insights, wild aggression, even some egregious misinformation. So what this suggests here, and I have the book Jeffersonian Legacies, and I read through the essays, and what is sort of indicative of that is there was the outright refusal to bring in scholars such as Garrett Ward Shelton and Merrill Peterson, who was the foremost authority of Jefferson at the time when Pete Onuf took his position at UVA. And it was a sort of, again, I use the term circus-like environment, okay? We talked about, a lot of good stuff went on, reason to brace brilliant insights, but then we have the wild aggression, some egregious misinformation. And Jordan writes of this with verve and excitement, as if somehow all this zaniness, this gloves off approach to Jeffersonian scholarship is a helpful thing. But again, this gives us some idea of how Onuf views historiography. It's not a veridical or truthful enterprise for Onuf, but it's a matter of anything goes. There is no truth for Onuf. We talked about Onufian historiography. There is no truth for Onuf. It's a matter of giving roughly each person trying to give a roughly consistent view of Thomas Jefferson, and where we go from there, who knows? So I think what happened and how they justified this sort of chaotic environment, the tohu bohu that reigned there, is they use a quote from Thomas Jefferson. We're not afraid to follow the truth wherever it may lead, nor tolerate any error so long as reason left free to combat it. Onuf and his ilk, Onuf and his minions really have little regard for truth. They have little regard for reason. And it's very strange they should use this. This quote was put in for pedantic, justificatory reasons to try to show that if you want to say that this is too wild of an environment for any serious scholarship, this is sort of what you need if you really want to get at the true path. So the idea here was to have a postmodernist. Postmodernism takes us beyond modernism, which uses logic and reasoned debate, which uses facts to ground narratives. Here we don't need to be troubled by logic, rational debate, and facts, right? We can just go on. Now, some of the people who wrote and who spoke at the conference and wrote essays for the edited book by Paul Conkin said Jefferson was a creature of mood and sentiment much more than a rigorous thinker. He tended to paper over the problematic or inconsistent elements in the thought of his heroes. In the end, he always ended up with such an eclectic mix of ideas as to defy systematic ordering. This is really a ridiculous sentiment by a dilettantish scholar, someone who dabbles in Thomas Jefferson. We have an eclectic mix of ideas. I've shown in numerous of my books that Jefferson was a rigorous thinker, a bottom-up thinker, a very rigorous thinker who had high regard for logic and morality, even when he wrote. Riz Isaac said in his essay, First Monticello, we as humans in the cultures to which we belong are largely constructed in and knowable through the stock stories we possess or that possess us. Now, I don't know what the hell that means. That's more postmodernist, complete postmodernist bullshit. What we get here is a bunch of bafflegab. Postmodernists think is that we're in an environment created by the environment, we interact with the environment. It's sort of chaotic interaction, all things considered, right? And we go along there. So, I mean, we just have a quote here that doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, right? Okay. He says talks about Thomas Jefferson. His whole system was designed by the unexamined logic of his stories, whatever that means, that the stories are inconsistent, illogical. He doesn't think through them, and he just tells a bunch of stories here or there, and that's how we get Thomas Jefferson narrative. Of course, Paul Finkelman includes an essay, and he savagely attacks Thomas Jefferson. He says, he addresses the issue of presentism, that we're going to use modern day concerns, which was the name of the conference, to evaluate Jefferson. And Finkelman says, we don't even have to worry about presentism. Even by the standards of his own times, he failed. He says Jefferson was the intellectual godfather of the racist pseudoscience of the American School of Anthropology, and therefore he fails to test. Now, Stephen Conrad, in his essay, Putting Right's Talk in His Place, looks at Jefferson's visionary ideas. He said, we encounter questions about how accurate, however ultimately salutary it is, after all, to invoke Jefferson uncritically to legitimate a rights-based reform of American constitutional law. And in this critical analysis, he footnotes, in a footnote, he has Richard Rorty, a pragmatic philosopher who has since passed, a bright man, who said, Rorty makes eloquently the case for setting aside questions of historical accuracy and philosophical justification in order to sustain the present-day cause of international human rights, cause that has lately invoked the Jeffersonian tradition to profound effect. In other words, we don't have to care about truth. We don't have to care about philosophical justification. says historical accuracy can be thrown away, so can philosophical justification. I assume he means warrant for the claims you made, or even a moral dimension. But we need to address human rights issues, meaning slavery and racial equality and so forth. I've said this 1,000 times already. It's really quite ridiculous to think we can address human rights concerns if we toss aside historical accuracy and philosophical justification. Part of that justification being veridicality. If we throw away any notion of what is true, what is false, philosophical justification, then why should we care about human rights issues? Why should we care about racial equality, slavery? Why should we care about equal rights for women? Why should we care about anything, right? There has to be some sense of we have to have some measure of evaluative standards that are not just based on conventionality. They're not just based about a bunch of intellectual people getting in a room and agreeing on some standards without justification. So we have this really sort of gloves off, ridiculous conference at which very little, if anything, was established. And Dan Jordan was an intimate part of that. He, again, wrote the foreword to this. And more than that, he participated as well in structuring with Onuf the events and so forth. Okay, last question. The second event at Thomas Jefferson Foundation Studies is 1998 DNA study, that the reply to 1998 DNA study. Monticello come with some sort of, at the leadership of Dan Jordan, they come up with some sort of a study in 2000, published 2000, and this is claimed to be on the story in civic scholarship. What does foundation have to say about 1998 DNA study? We know famously that they say that Jefferson was father of all Sally Hemings children, very, very likely. Is that a good conclusion? Please tell. All right, your last question. You talk of the 1998 DNA study in Nature headed by Dr. Eugene Foster. The title of that was Jefferson Fathered Slave's Last Child, and there were a number of conclusions, some of which exonerated Thomas Jefferson from paternity. But the most unsettling, I should say, conclusion was that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Eston Hemings, and the 1808 child of Sally Hemings. Why? Because Eston Hemings had the Jefferson Y chromosome, and everybody in the male line of Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson's father, his uncle, Jefferson's brother, any male Jefferson's brother's sons would have the same Y chromosome. So we found out that a descendant of Eston Hemings had the Jefferson Y chromosome, so he must have been fathered by a Jefferson. The people behind the study said it's very likely to be Thomas Jefferson. All right. Within 24 hours of the 1998 release of the study, linking Jefferson to the paternity of Hemings' son, this is the webpage, Monticello held a press conference, posted public sentiments on the website, instructed interpreters in how to initiate conversations on the subject with visitors. The foundation pledged to continuously, split your infinitive here, guys, evaluate all relevant evidence. They've never done that. Advancing our firm belief in telling a story here that is accurate and honest and thus inclusive about Jefferson's remarkable life and legacy in the context of the complex of extraordinary plantation community that was Monticello, right? This is, a statement put out with the backing of then President Dan Jordan. The study comes out, Monticello's has to have a word on it, so they set up a committee, right? And the chair is Diane Swan Wright. I'll say something. She is a Black rights activist. She passed away. And most of the people involved are people internal to Monticello. They did not go out and seek people who don't have some sort of investment in the cause, right? And most of the people here are not scholars. We have a communication officer, the director of archaeology, educational instructor, an interpreter, senior research historian, a head guide, and director of research. White Mackenzie Wallenberg, who recently passed away, Dr. Ken, was on the committee, and he was the sole dissenting voice. Now, the results of the study were published in January 2000. It's called the Report of the Research Committee and Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings. Okay, members met 10 times from December 1998, so literally 1991 January. So they met 10 times within the course of a year's span of time and discussed what they called their scientific data and relevant historical evidence. And they came up with the conclusion that the DNA study was I don't want to say meticulously conducted, but that there were no flaws in the conduct of the study. The conclusion, they agreed with the researchers, and Monticello people said, and here Dan Jordan at the lead, the DNA study combined with multiple strands of currently available documentary and statistical evidence indicates a high probability that Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings, that he most likely was the father of all of the 5 other Sally Hemings children appearing in Jefferson's records, right? And go on to name. Now, how they conclude that when the DNA only one sample was taken from one child of Sally Hemings, of a descendant of one of the childs, Eston Hemings. None of the other children were sampled in the DNA, but how the hell can we conclude that unless we presume that whoever fathers and had the father all the others, that Sally Hemings had only one paramour, only one lover? We can't just conclude that. Her mother had 4 lovers, and we know that, and had children by 4 different fathers. Why do we know? We assume that that was the case with Sally Hemings. We can't. I think what is really fascinating to me, and I spoke about this in a prior episode, is that the very chair of the committee, Diane Swan Wright, edits a book titled Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, History, Member, and Civic Culture. This is published in 1999, the year where they're supposed to be doing all the meetings and the research. So she has published. So she has in the offing a collection of essays that's going on, probably collected early on. They already have the conclusion settled prior to doing any sort of serious committee work. If the book is published in 1999, and for the most part, the committee starts doing its research in January 1999, right? The research on the book and the collection of essays had to begin immediately after the DNA study is published. Now, White Mackenzie Wallenborn, who is a man, I think, of high probity, objected to the goings-on in the committee. He claimed that there was a witch hunt for Thomas Jefferson, that the committee was not in search of the truth. He writes in a published essay, I was right when I reported to Dan Jordan in early March that the committee had reached their decision long before all the information had been studied. And sure enough, all the evidence that would have exonerated Mr. Jefferson had been discovered. In other words, they did not look at all the relevant information. They sort of glossed over any evidence to the contrary and just picked out the evidence that they found interesting. And I said, Swan Wright already is publishing or editing a collection of essays on Jefferson and Sally Hemings even prior to their doing any sort of committee work to decide the issue. Jefferson was found guilty prior to the committee doing any serious research. And Wallenberg's assessment of Jefferson's innocence, he never really said Jefferson was innocent. He just said the manner of conduction of the committee, of the research of the committee, was seriously flawed. when he objected and submitted his minority report and he gave it to Dan Jordan. Dan Jordan brushed it aside, did not share it with anybody. Why would Jordan do that? But he does. He doesn't share the minority report. It's only after Dr. Ken forced the issue that the minority report was shared. It's still up on Monticello's website, but it's given short shrift. Makes it look, as Monticello keeps saying, I call this the consilience argument. There's so much overwhelming evidence pro-paternity and really very little, if anything, anti-paternity. The opposite is the case. This is a very Vladimir Putin-like assertion. There's not much evidence for something. They claim, there's all the evidence for it and nothing against it. The opposite is really the case, as I've showed before. All right. Now, the head of the study, Eugene Foster, came under the gun by a number of scientists when he published his essay in Nature. And Foster would wind up saying about his study, the whole affair has been conducted by amateurs. I include myself. The strange thing is nowhere on Monticello's website do they include that sort of information, which is typical of the sort of cherry picking that goes on at Monticello. Now, as Boris said, next week we're going to be looking at Leslie Green Bowman and we'll analyze her tenureship there as well. All right, I like to think Dr. Holowchak, polkovnik or colonel, and you would tell you next week we look at the legacy of Leslie Green Bowman, who succeeded Dan Jordan as president of Monticello when Jordan retired. We know Jordan recently passed away, and we give condolences to family. We shall ask the colonel about the legacy of Leslie Green Bowman. Did she bring things in up direction or things go down? That's for next week. So thank you for watching. If you like, please like this show. Please share the show. And you can invite Dr. Holowchak to speak at your business, at your academic institution, or your business. And you can buy, of course, any one of his books. Thank you very much.